Welcome to this AL development session on decolonizing computing. Does computing need to be decolonized? What might that mean? Doesn't that presume that computing is colonial? And how can that be given that colonialism, as a phenomenon tied up with imperial structures of domination and settlement, is a thing of the past? How can computing be colonial if the age of empires is over and we live in a post-colonial world? To make the case for decolonizing computing, I clearly need to show how computing is colonial, at least in some sense. But before I can do that, I need to set out what I mean by computing. I take the view that computing in general, or as a rule, is a socio-technical phenomenon. That is, computing as a practice involving the design, construction, maintenance and use of devices and systems emerging within a social, by which I mean political, economic and cultural context, but also shaping that context. In short, computing is an entanglement of the social and the technical. But even if that is computing as a rule, it is important to appreciate that rules tend to have exceptions, and here they refer to those specific areas within computing that are more technical in nature, such as theories and models of computation, the mathematics of computability, and the various formal and logical proofs and theorems associated with them. But even if we accept that computing is a socio-technical phenomenon in general, how does that support the claim that computing is colonial? To answer that question, we need to understand a little bit about the history of computing, the world in which it emerged, and the world in which it continues to develop. Let me start with the world. Firstly, it's important to understand the difference between the world and the planetary phenomenon that is the Earth. By world, I refer to an interrelated totality of things, both natural and humanly constructed, a spatial temporal, that is, a geographical historical, matrix in which both human and non-human beings are embedded. Insofar as worlds come into existence through the actions of differently positioned human beings exercising differential power, there is a need to understand how the world that we inhabit came to be the way that it is, especially if we are to understand that the world could have been made differently. In short, that other worlds were and are possible. Yet what is the world that we have inherited? According to world systems theorist Immanuel Wallerstein, the history of the modern world has been, in large part, a history of the expansion of European states and peoples into the rest of the world, commencing with the so-called Columbian voyages of discovery in 1492 of the Common Era, and which resulted in the emergence of a capitalist world economy. An important, arguably categorical, difference between European colonialism and classical or pre-modern colonialism is that, according to Wallerstein, European colonialism brought forth a world system constituted by a European core and a non-European periphery. Put another way, the modern world came into being through what the late cultural theorist Stuart Hall referred to as the violent structural opposition of the West and the rest during the longue durée of the 16th century of the Common Era and thereafter. Furthermore, and crucially, European colonialism, in contrast to earlier forms of colonialism, was a project with religious come racial foundations, insofar as there was a constitutive entanglement of colonialism with race-making, that is, the social construction of races. For this reason, some have argued that if we are going to think about the world in political and economic terms, we need to be talking about racial capitalism rather than capitalism per se. and insofar as there is no modernity without colonialism, we should be speaking about the modern colonial world rather than about the modern world. Colonialism, as a project of European political domination involving settlement, formally ended with the national liberation and independence, or decolonization, movements of the 1960s. Yet the modernity which colonialism engendered persists, albeit transformed under the condition of postmodernity, which has meant the persistence of certain colonial ways of knowing and being based on systems of categorization, classification, and taxonomization, and the embedding of these in practices, artifacts, and technologies. It is these ongoing legacy structures and practices, what is referred to as coloniality, which persist in the contemporary post-colonial era, notwithstanding the formal end of colonialism, that I suggest need to be considered in relation to the question concerning whether computing is colonial. While recognizing that the history of computing, like other histories, is a contested terrain, and duly acknowledging the entanglement of history with geography and both with power, it is a fact that computers, programming, artificial intelligence, the internet, and ICTs all emerged in the West, primarily Britain and the US, against the backdrop of inter-European military conflict, the Second World War, and post-war ideological conflict, the Cold War, both of which were relationally entangled with colonized populations along what African American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois referred to as the color line. For this reason, I suggest that the histories and geographies of computing and colonialism are entangled, insofar as the origins of computing are tied to European come Western imperial projects and militarized industrialized contexts whose legacy effects persist in the contemporary post-colonial era. In this connection, and by way of some examples, consider resource extraction in the Congo, which has gone on for centuries and which continues to power computing in the global north, commencing with the extracting of copper for computing systems during the Cold War, and more recently cobalt for lithium-ion batteries and coltan for mobile devices. Tracking supply chains under racial capitalism affords us an insight into the coloniality of computing as resources, patterns of consumption, and the production of waste create circuits involving the core and periphery of the world system. On this basis, I suggest that computing, at least in its mainstream dominant form, is colonial in some sense, because, as a modern phenomenon, it is founded upon and continues to embody aspects of colonialism, specifically the structural and facilitating logics of coloniality. Going further, it might be that computing does not merely carry the legacy systemic traces of colonialism, but is fundamentally driven by a relentless colonizing logic, what human-computer interaction theorists and practitioners Paul Dorish and Scott Mainwaring have described as a pervasive and expansionist colonial impulse. Although they argued this in the context of ubiquitous computing, I suggest that this colonial impulse is far more deeply embedded in the broader expansionist thrust of computing associated with the transformation of the modern world through incessant computerization, latterly digitalization, and more recently datafication and algorithmization, leading some commentators to talk about the rise of surveillance capitalism and digital and data colonialism. In this connection, Paula Chakravarty and Mara Mills offer a useful provocation, and I quote, "If computing technology is the embodiment of rational calculation and a driver of 21st century capitalism, can it indeed be decolonized, overhauled, or appropriated for other ends? Although I remain somewhat skeptical about the possibility of decolonizing computing anytime soon, I want to set out what it might mean given what has been said thus far. Briefly, decolonization refers to the process of dismantling colonialism, that is, the relationship between colonizer and colonized, including its persistent legacy effects in the post-colonial era. Insofar as the legacy effects assume structural form, both in terms of asymmetric power relations between people and between people and technological infrastructure, adopting a decolonizing, or rather decolonial, orientation entails two basic commitments. Firstly, an embrace of the decolonial turn, which involves delinking, that is, decentering of Eurocentrism, West-centrism, North-centrism as the preeminent site of knowledge production, and secondly, embrace of the decolonial option, which involves a preferential option toward those situated in the margins and the peripheries of the modern colonial world system, with a view to effecting reparations and compensation, and thereby seeking redress for the legacy effects of colonialism. Researchers and practitioners adopting a decolonial computing perspective are required, at a minimum, to do the following. Firstly, consider their positionality, both in terms of who they are and where they are located, when designing, building, researching, or theorizing about computing and ICT phenomena. Secondly, embrace the decolonial option as a political, ethical stance, attempting to think through what it might mean to design, build, maintain, and use computing and ICT systems with and for those situated at the margins and peripheries of the world system, with a view to undermining the asymmetry of local global power relations. Given that I'm talking to computing educators, I'd like to share a couple of quotes from an article entitled "Why Computing Belongs Within the Social Sciences," which appeared in the communications of the ACM a couple of years back. The quote is as follows: "We normalize the belief that the world is irrelevant next to computing, precisely through the structure of our curriculum. We need to do better and be willing to inform both our work and our thinking with the more nuanced, historically grounded, empirically supported thinking of the social sciences." End quote. I agree. Yet let us be mindful of the particularities of our discipline, that it is at least as much about designing, building, maintaining, and using stuff, devices, systems, infrastructure, etc., as it is about how we think and talk about such users. As we draw upon the social sciences with a view to decolonize computing and its curriculum to better prepare our students to build a different, better world. Thank you.